Today's topic, just briefly, was what key things need to change to improve our prison system. Now that is a little bit like, that's like asking the most ridiculous question in the world, because there's so much, in my view, that needs to change. But I think it's just the, let's generalise about the things that are most important to you, whether that be in your sort of lived experience of experiencing the system, or whether as somebody who supports it from an organisational point of view, what key things you think should be focused on. Just before we get started, obviously we've just mentioned about the recording. If you're okay with that, you stay as you are. If you're not okay with that, you might want to just make yourself invisible to the rest of the audience. And then just some Zoom etiquette. We're just a small group today, so don't worry too much about this. Just pipe up if there's something that you'd like to say, but typically we use the raise hand function and mute and unmute, but you can keep yourselves off mute for today, and we can all just participate as and when we see fit. So Claire, just to kind of do a brief introduction in terms of what the evidence says, and then I was going to hand over to you to do your like quick presentation, maybe like 10 minutes if that's okay, and then that'll sort of open us up to discussion, because I think the two feed in quite nicely to each other. So Adam, are you okay to give Claire sharing rights as well? See you, Paul. So the evidence, sort of just briefly to touch on some of the evidence and reports that have been floating around over the past sort of 6-7 years. The first one that I was exposed to or part of was the James Sally-Coates review, which was called Unlocking Potential, and that was a really important review into the state of prison education, which for as long as it's been around, I think has been deemed not fit for purpose. So yeah, to kind of, that's one report that kind of critiqued the state of the prison education system. Then we had Lord Farmer, who focused on the golden thread of rehabilitation, and that's families and visitors to the prison estate and how they support and aid a prisoner's journey. So you might have a particular interest in that. Then more recently, as in 2 weeks ago, we have Richard Halfon, who's chair of the Education Select Committee, who did another important review into prison education and what's lacking, and came up with some more recommendations, which we'll probably ignore and be talking about in a few years' time. Mainly around making prison education the heart of the prison system and how we do that, the mechanisms which we can use to do that. Then we had Dame Carol Black's really important two-phase review of drug treatment, prevention and recovery, which is a huge, trigger for offending. Most of the revolving door of offending is around substance misuse. So for me, that's a really important way of reducing crime and making the prison system work better for everybody, would be to have some sort of drug intervention in every single prison that's fit for purpose. And then obviously we've got the things that, may have escaped some report writing or reviews, but we know that homelessness is a big cause of reoffending, which was an all-time high during COVID. I think they said that almost 2/3 of prisoners were being released NFA during that time. Which was probably due to the fact that outside here we were tackling homelessness for the first time in forever. So they may have just kind of left that up to the local authorities to deal with. We've also got unemployment as a route of reoffending, and as a route away from offending. If you're in employment, you're 50% less likely, roughly, to commit another offence, which is obviously a big kind of trigger around recidivism and reoffending rates. And then any other issues that you think are important that we may not have touched upon, that you would like us to touch upon and maybe focus our efforts on. So yeah, just to kind of get your initial thoughts around that before we go on to Claire's presentation. Anybody can pipe up. Somebody's put something in the chat facility. Hello from Val. You need to prepare for your event. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I might be on and off. I might not be able to have full concentration for the whole hour, but we're celebrating the life of somebody who's a poet, and he was a racial equality officer in Bristol for a long time. Unfortunately, he somehow got arrested for wrong identity, which he said was not true. After he was released, he was homeless for a few years, and it's a very sad story, and we are sort of, all the people who still know him are going to celebrate the event, and I was the main organizer, so this will be today at 7, so I'm still a bit tied up with it. But I wanted to see how much disadvantage people actually have once they leave prison, how bad and how difficult it is. I mean, what can you do really if you don't get a place, if you don't get a job, and you don't have any support? And so he's an example as well. Yes, and it's great to see you. So I'll be still there, and really looking forward to listening to you. Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
Val.
Yes.
So-
I put myself on mute again, and I'm also representing Acorn Foundation because we have sort of mentoring programs for prisoners, and so we have quite a lot of things you can look up on Acorn. Thank you.
Thanks, Val.
No, it's a very interesting subject, though, isn't it? Sort of prison reform, and things do need to be changed. But, and I've not been popular when I've said this in the past, the biggest catalyst for change are the people in prisons themselves. It's all well and good politicians and advocacy groups saying what needs to be done, but if the people who are getting the cell door closed on them every night aren't on board, and who actually don't believe things need to be changed and reformed, what chance actually is there? You know, because when you're in prison yourself and you talk about pertinent issues, you're likely to have fellow prisoners saying, oh, it's prison, just deal with it. So it needs to come down to the people who are living in prisons, really, to actually be on board to the idea that things actually do need to change for better.
I don't know, a challenge that I think that's a bit of a simplistic view, and I think I get where that comes from, because you haven't experienced homelessness on release and things just through having a support mechanism. But I think that's not many prisoners' experiences, if I'm honest. So, you know, for example, telling a prisoner that it's up to them when they're faced with homelessness on the day of release with it used to be £46, it's now what, 76 or 80 something pounds. I don't know what it's gone up to, don't know whether it's stayed up either, but it's not enough to survive until your first benefits payment comes in. And then, you know, and then imagine that you're in supported accommodation, which is really chaotic. I just see some of the barriers that our learners go through in terms of they want to go straight and they want a better life, but there are systemic barriers. So let's bring it back to the prison estate then, just so that we can kind of have a focused topic. What things need to be improved as a priority in prison to make desistance or to make change a reality for people? Come on, I know you're not that quiet. Who have we got? Thomas, what are your thoughts on it in terms of your own lived experience?
I think that, you know, the size of the prison population is an issue. You know, like they're pretty chaotic places, and you know, the ratio of prisoners to officers. You know, now I was moved into lower category prisons, but it was, you know, and I was in during COVID, so there was no education anyway. So it was really, you know, on permanent lockdown. So, you know, the focus, to my mind, the focus was to keep you alive and keep you in the walls. That was about it. There wasn't, you know, there was some bits and pieces going on, but you had to basically root them out yourself. And some were pointless. They did a web design course without any access to IT equipment to draw out what your web page should look like, you know. So it was you know, it was something to do, but other than that, it wasn't of any benefit whatsoever, you know. And I think trying to link what people are doing with something on the outside is important. You know, there's no point teaching people to be, you know, a kitchen assistant and then they leave and that's it. You know, there isn't a link up on the outside, and trying to get businesses to, you know, get to prison and the government and organizations to approach organizations to say, you know, we want a pathway for these people to follow. So, you know, we'll have 5 people coming out a year who could potentially be kitchen workers, so that, you know, because if it's up to the person who's being released, his concern is, will I get asked, do I have a criminal record? And does that knock me out of the job? Where if it's up front that this person does have a criminal record, but they've done this training in on the inside, would be a way to employment, I would have thought.
So for you, the contextualised learning around adult learning, the stuff that we know around adult learning is really important in terms of the buy-in. Why am I learning this qualification? How relevant is it to me getting the job that I want on the outside, which I think that's come up in both reviews actually. Both prison education reviews was that the learning quality in prisons horrendous, like 60% graded inadequate or not good enough, as opposed to 20%.
I'll tell you what was excellent, was they had Way Out TV.
Yeah.
They had some really good courses, but it was just watching TV. There wasn't really any way of signing up to the course in where I was. But there was some really good quality stuff in that, I thought. They had one like a mini MBA, which was really good.
That's crazy, isn't it? So what did you like specifically around that, the breadth of knowledge that was available? Or
it was really good course, you know. If we wanted, you know, I got in touch with them on release to see if it's possible to do it, because it was a really focused, clearly for people with professional qualifications or wanted to get sort of into a very sort of relatively senior role. But it was really good quality course, because I sort of come from that area. But the quality of that was top class. So, you know, you could have shown that in any MBA, you know, executive MBA, and would have been seen as being pretty good, certainly from my point of view.
So this was a course, Thomas, that you accessed via Way Out, but you didn't have any accreditation. You couldn't get an accreditation from it. It was literally knowledge for the sake of knowledge, for knowledge sake. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a thing around learning for the sake of learning, isn't there? But you would have preferred that if it was accredited, I suppose, and translated into something on the outside, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sure there was assignments that could have been done and things like that, which would have been good to do as well.
I'm just going to open it up to the rest of the panel attendees. Anything else that you think needs to be a focus? Go, Ruth.
I was only just going to chip into Thomas to say, you know, firstly, if he wants any help with trying to track down to be able to complete that course, because it does sound like it was a really useful one. I'm in regular contact with Jez Wright from Way Out TV, so I could try and help with that. But also we do, sorry, a bit of a plug for our organisation. I'm from DWRM, and we do support people when you leave prison to carry on with your education and training. So I'll pop my contact details in the chat, Thomas, and I'm happy to help see if you can complete that course, because it does sound like it was a really useful one.
Yeah, definitely. Any other sort of things that we think are hindering people that are going into prison and aren't really helping to churn out productive members of society? I mean, if there's no takers, one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy in the world is the lack of therapy that's available, and I think I'm kind of focused on substance misuse therapy, given the driver that is in terms of, you know, people that are in petty offences and that revolving door of crime, as I mentioned earlier, but also, you know, potentially therapy that isn't for people that are locked in substance misuse, that just helps people to overcome their demons and deal with their trauma. For example, well, that doesn't happen, and there's pros and cons for both, I think, because I'm a little bit scared of having, especially in male prisons. I think therapy is kind of accepted in female prisons, but in male prisons, can we create a safe space in most prisons where men can be really vulnerable and then go back onto the wings and not have that vulnerability used against them? I don't know whether most prisons, for example, local prisons, can offer that safe environment. So I think we need to be careful. It needs to be done in a proper way. But then I see other things like Oakwood, where they've got basically prisoners running a drug rehab wing there that's, you know, all about mutual aid and peer interventions, and it's really successful. So for me, therapy is a big part of that journey, that rehabilitative journey, but I don't think it's enough on its own. Maybe I think if I was going to focus on two things, it would be therapeutic interventions in custody and then continuing out into the community, and also prison education, doing what it says on the tin, which is taking people from A to B and then closer to the work of the labour market. But I'm open for challenge. What are your thoughts, Richard? You're on mute.
Is that better?
Yes.
Right. Well, I mean, if I just focus on the educational side, because my sense is education for what? You know, if you're just educating someone as something for them to do until they're released, and it's not actually going to do them much good. So, you know, people need a path. They need a route map, as it were. It's kind of, okay, why am I doing this? Where am I going with it? And to try and my own view, because I was very lucky. I managed to do some work with prison governors about helping fellow offenders to look at their employment needs and look at their education needs and stuff. And that was very unusual, but it gave me a real insight into the lack of aspiration, really, that people were encouraged to go for things. You know, and there are so many different levels of individuals within the prison system. Doing this kind of one size fits all doesn't work. So for me, it's about trying to, I mean, I'm now very much focused on trying to make the connection for people who are time served in terms of what can they do in terms of employment, simply because a lot of people who have served time will run a mile from the institutions that are trying to help them. That's natural. It's a fear of that institution. Whereas, you know, if we, again, let me just say, one of the issues I had was you had people who were trying to help inmates, offenders, whatever you want to call us, when they were there, who weren't necessarily experienced in the subjects that they were dealing with. So,
give us an example.
Well, there were people that were trying to teach others about self-employment and things, and they weren't actually self-employed, and they'd never been self-employed. Well, that to me is crazy. I mean, that's a wider issue, but it is, I give you that as an example. So to try and create, I think also one of the important things, trying to create a system where the person is at the center and you're doing it with them, you're not doing it to them, would make a massive difference.
But how do we, so playing devil's advocate and trying to, I suppose, critical think around these things, how do we do that with a prison population of 80,000? How can we expect a system that's, let's be honest, has no money and is looking to have even less money over the coming years? How do we ask them to do more for less in terms of that person-centered stuff?
Does some of this not fall when people are actually first put into custody and a sentence plan's actually made? Because sentence plans seem to be too much about risk and intervention work and everything. I think probation should be duty bound to actually say, well, hang on a second, what are your ambitions when you are released? You know, what do you need to stick to? What do you need to achieve? What goals do you need to set yourself? And half the time, a lot of things, although, you know, qualifications can be valuable, sometimes knowledge is just as good. You learn a lot just through talking to people from different backgrounds who've experienced different things in life. You know, that's how we learn things in the outside world even. You know what I mean? So there needs to be more encouragement upon peers supporting peers inside and outside of prison, just to actually utilise and share each other's life skills to help people progress and to open doors for one another.
But I think for that, we need to break down the walls of suspicion on both sides against each other. This being staff and prisoners.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a suspicion, like, as you said, we are very risk adverse and risk focused when it comes to people coming into custody, and we start assessing them, and that we are way too risk adverse, and we need to change that. But I think there's also an element of putting trust into that institution, but obviously the institution is like that in a position of power, so it needs to start from them. But we need to break down those barriers to work together rather than kind of pulling two sides.
Yeah, one of the things that came out of what Richard was saying to me was around culture, because I think that's how you can make it a bit of a person-centered experience.
Yeah.
In a time when there is no money. It's to change the culture so that those key workers, those people that, you know, deal with induction in education or whatever induction the person's got to attend, can kind of have those conversations around, you know, what are your aspirations, what's good about you, not just what's bad about you, what's negative about you, what's risky about you. Really having those kind of existential questions that are so important and that just aren't had. So I think culture is something that was mentioned in both of the educational reviews as well, actually, and it was mentioned at an HMPPS Insights Day I went to a couple of weeks ago, where this was the problem that we were talking about. You've got disenfranchised staff that have paid terrible rates of pay, that have got no support from their management team. You know, you've got this really unhappy workforce that are doing really, really important work, working with like the most damaged and whatever people of society, me being one of them at one point. So it's like, yeah, how do we kind of make it less about them and us and more about the prison community? I think that has to be a culture. That has to be a culture dilemma, doesn't it? And then for me, that's like training around, like we spoke about Graduates Unlocked and some of the innovative stuff that's been done there around rehabilitative culture and that kind of language being used, rather than when I've done a key talk, for example, when I had keys for one of my local prisons, the language that was being used in that room before they knew I was an ex-prisoner was around prisoners being stuck and just managing the risk. That was literally the conversation. There was nothing around rehabilitation or individuals at all. It was very much, we were compared to mobile phones, in fact. No, there's something I've never thought of, prisoners being like as easy as mobile phones to manage. But yeah, so I think culture is a big thing that's probably come out of this conversation that needs to be a focus on how we change that.
My house guest Emma's just raised a valuable point, and I've only got one device in here, so if I put Emma on the screen here.
Hi guys. Hi. I had a partner who was in HMP Stafford for 3.5 years. Towards the end of his residency there, he took part in a rail track course. I'm not sure of the actual name of it. And it was literally a carrot dangled on a stick. It encouraged good behaviour. You could get onto the course if you maintained the good behaviour that you were on. But there's absolutely no way on this earth that he would ever have been able to have a lucrative career in the railway industry because he wasn't able to travel. His confinement of his probation on release would never have allowed him to fulfil the duty of the job that he was offered. So what is the point? So I mean, Stafford is a sex offender prison, and no, whatever. But why would you be offering that type of course to somebody who can't fulfil that requirement? It's just a waste of the funding. It's a waste of their time. And even at one point, I mean, the lecturer did turn up and just said, none of you are going to get jobs. It was just a horrible experience for all the people who were on that course. But it's so heavily endorsed and so heavily funded. It should be spent on other things than this railway track that they've got there. And when they trolley around on the tours of Stafford prison, you've been yourself, haven't you, Adam? I've been. Yeah. And that is, you know, ta-da, look what we've got here. When actually it's just these people can't fulfil the requirements of the role that they're trained to study for. It's very cruel, very, very cruel.
So a more joined up approach then between the external statutory services maybe that kind of dictate the risk element once out in the community and the stuff that's going on the prison. I mean, just to take that kind of community as an example though, because we work in employment people with sex offences are notoriously difficult to place into any sort of employment market. It does happen. I'm glad to say it does happen, but it's difficult because of the barriers that are faced, perceived and actual. But if you've got somebody, so going back to what Richard said, I think if you've got somebody in prison that's maybe looking at a long sentence, maybe 15 years, what should we do in terms of those people with education? Is education something that just helps people to survive their sentence and to come out better than they started, or should it always have an end goal in terms of progression?
Can I pick that one up for a minute? I mean, I'm not so sure about the long sentence aspect, because, I mean, no education, formal education, lasts for longer than 6-7 years maximum, right? So unless you want to create multiple degree people, which is a bit crazy, it's kind of, it doesn't really make too much sense. But one of the things that I looked at, and I did quite a lot of work on this whilst I was serving time, was what can you do with your fellow, if you want, the prison cohort? What can you do to actually make them add value to the prison? You change the dynamic completely from, you know, you are behind your cell door to actually you're a part of the prison community, and it made a massive difference. I did a project and I employed, in inverted commas, 6 people. It was only for about 6 months, but it made a difference. And the difference it made was not only because it gave me something interesting to do, it gave them something interesting to do. And it wasn't a formal education. It was like Adam said, it wasn't a formal education at all, but it was a practical something that they could do and they could see some benefit to where they were. And it helped their self-esteem, and it helped their relationship with the prison staff.
So was it a project-based?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
I can share that. I can't share it now, but I can share it with you at another time so you can see, because I'm very keen to try and get that as a model going again, because part of the rehabilitation that I sold it as a process to these people on was, this is something for me to do when I am released. This is an opportunity for me to create, do some good and do some interesting things. So I'm very keen on trying to find out what an individual can contribute, and then you work together. Now, I know that that's an intensive process, but here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily cost money, because you can use people who were, such as myself, spending time inside. We had nowhere else to go. So what are you going to do? There are those people that will respond positively if you give them the opportunity. That was my, I mean, it's not a very common experience, but that doesn't mean to say it can't happen, and it doesn't happen with other people, because it does happen with other people. And I would, I think there's something about trying to accelerate that process and get that message into the system in such a way that that can be something, the idea that, like Adam was saying, this is the peer-to-peer thing, if you can make a change and you have experience of the lived experience, the horrendous phrase lived experience, then why not, as an opportunity, try and give something back, because you're going to make the lives of those that are coming after you better.
So is that broadly what you're talking about, purposeful activity or meaningful activity in prisons? As in,
absolutely, purposeful activity, yeah. Because a lot of it is just to pass the time, and you go, well, so what? But if you can join the dots up and say, well, here's an outcome, this is what we're trying to do, and you've got, within the prison system, you've got the prison workshops. Now, they utilize a percentage of the population, and that's a useful service, there's no question. But I'm talking about what can you do internally. You can internalize some of those functions, and you can make things easier for people and you can make a contribution to that establishment, that of itself, you come to release and you have someone that's done that, that's a talking point for them that somebody else can't bring. So I think it's, I mean, I know it's just, that's systemic. That's about a significant shift. But it would be an aspiration that I would like to put on the table, and that I've tried to put on the table with people, is, look, you know, how can you engage people, never mind what they can do when they are released, what can they do for you when they're in here?
The problem that I think we've got at the moment, I don't know about the rest of the people in attendance, but we work closely with a few prisons. And one of the issues that they've still got at the moment is they can't even really facilitate the regime working as it should, like a normal prison regime in terms of hours out of cell, getting people to jobs and education, because staff are still going down with COVID and things, and staff shortages in general. So I think there's just, I think the feedback is that there's just an issue practically of getting people out of cells at the moment. Then you've got the political side, which are the Prison Officers Association and the powers that be trying to keep people banged up for longer because it's safer or because it's more cost effective. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of contradicting factors, I think, that would say they agree with you and with us, everything that we're saying, but actually it comes down to how are we going to get these guys and girls out of cell and doing anything, let alone what we're talking about, like meaningful and purposeful activity. Prison industry has been something that we've provided to various prisons for the past few years, and the prisoners love it because, like you say, majority of prisoners, if not everybody, wants to be productive with their time. Nobody wants to feel like a complete waste person, that's just a sponge. You know, that feeling of doing something positive is addictive, as well as the other side is addictive. So if we're not giving them the opportunity to access stuff like that, that's a worrying state of affair for me.
Oh, I agree.
Right, jump in there for a second.
Yeah.
So just in terms of the longer term stay people, you know, I think there's a lot of things that areas where people can be applied to in terms of sort of education and feeling productive. So there's things like creative writing, gardening, gym work, you know, being gym helper. The issue with all of those though is that they're seen as a privilege, and they're, you know, that they're held over people's heads then, that if they step out of line for anything, that privilege will be taken away from them. So there's no sense of security about being involved in those things, you know. So it's which creates the them and us scenario. So somebody could be, you know, a gym person, and that they, you know, it would be useful if there was sort of then some training around that, and listeners as well, you know, training around support in those areas. But again, if that all gets taken away at the drop of a hat, it, you know, it turns people off trying to do anything like that, because they just say, well, you know, I just get kicked. If now you might say, well, they shouldn't do anything wrong, but it creates that them and us scenario.
Definitely. One of the things, sorry, it might be a bit off piste here, but found a really good resource today. I didn't find it today, I found it when I was a prisoner back in whenever it was, 2007, 2006, and it really changed the trajectory of my prison sentence, just because I think we're getting to the point where self-help has to be a real ingredient that we empower prisoners to kind of access. That was a big part of my journey, but there's barriers there even in terms of reading and stuff that we've got to think about. But the link that I've just put in the chat facility is the Prison Phoenix Trust, and they've got some free resources if you work in prisons or with prisoners. They've also got free books that you can apply to have sent out to prisoners. So we've got a prisoner that we're supporting at the moment who can't access education because he knows the bloody tutor from normal life. So he's entry level 3, got booted off his English class, can't access education, and as such can't access a job because he's entry 3, and you need to have a level 1 to be a wing cleaner to be able to read the instructions. So it's a bit of a catch-22. So anyway, I've sent him these. Some of the resources are CDs for people that can't read. Some of them are very animated so that they have less text for those that aren't great readers, and then some of them are just normal books for the people that are a bit more able. So they really kind of touch the length and breadth of prisoners. But yeah, you can do that on behalf of serving prisoners, and it's just around meditation and yoga, things that they can do in cell if they are banged up for 23 hours a day. It's something that they can take control of. So I'd beg each and every one of you to look at that as a resource, and maybe to get some sent out to some of your prisoners that you're supporting. If we can now, if nobody's got anything that they urgently want to talk about, I was going to hand over to Claire Ferguson just to do a brief presentation on the work that they're doing at HMP Liverpool and with the local authority. And then I thought we could go back to a bit of a discussion, and then we'll close and let you all go on your happy bank holiday weekends. Whoop, whoop. Claire, do you want to share your screen or do what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Marie Claire. Can you hear me okay? Is my mic working? Fab. Okay, I'm normally a Teams person, so bear with me a few seconds while I try and find the presentation. Bear with me.
This is Claire's here because of the power of our network as well, because her partner, who was a speaker at our last conference and events, liked one of the other speakers at the conference. So yeah, they've kind of joined up, and then Claire's path and I cross paths. I think you just need to make it on
Full screen.
You go to slideshow.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, don't be put off by the fact that it is 9 slides. I will only do 1 or 2, so don't worry, I won't be here for that long. Probably a little bit of background and a bit of an introduction. So I'm Claire Ferguson, as it says on the tin. I'm a HMPPS employee, so my history has been working within prison settings for the last 10 years. My job predominantly before starting this secondment was Head of Learning and Skills at HMP Liverpool, but also acting Head of Reducing Reoffending. Essentially, the role that I'm doing currently is a secondment to the local authority, so Liverpool City Council. So still a permanent member of HMPPS staff, but seconded to the local authority. That secondment is jointly financed and supported by HMPPS, Merseyside Police, Taurus and the council. So there's a little bit here around getting our house in order in terms of public services in general. So I think a lot of the conversations today about what can we do from a prison perspective about actually improving outcomes and resettlement opportunities for people in custody and on release. I go a little bit further in that and say actually there's a public service reform need, not just a prison service reform. And it's how we work together as different aspects of public service that actually will make the difference in terms of accessing the right kind of support and supporting people both whilst they're in prison and when they're out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Reducing Reoffending project. I'll show you a slide based around the structure of it, so you've got a little bit of an idea about how we're actually fitting together and the kind of work we're aiming to do. But just to say thank you as well for allowing me to speak to you today, and for the conversation you were having before. There's lots of really good ideas there that we've tried previously and tested in prison setting, and there's fantastic pockets of good practice. And I think anybody that's worked with it or had experience of prison education or prison resettlement services will find there's cracking pockets of good practice, but it's that standardization of service that is not consistent, and actually maintaining some of that good practice and sharing it is predominantly I think where we're going to find a lot of our success. So ambition, keeping it quite simple. Anyone leaving custody, on licence, on probation, and their families have access to improved services to enable better resettlement into the community. Just trying to keep it as simple as possible. Those outcomes, so when we talk about resettlement outcomes, everything down from education, training, employment, job and training opportunities on release, the type of accommodation people access. Is it suitable? Is it sustainable? Dependency and recovery services, mental health, children and family services, finance, benefit and debt, the like. And how we do that, actually, I put it back to public service reform and actually developing and embedding a new way of working by aligning goals of existing public services and their commissioned and non-commissioned services that engage with them. but we do it through system change. We do it through embedded and sustainable change, not a nice project that everybody got involved with and it was, oh, wasn't that fantastic for 2 years? Actually, this needs to become sustainable and business as usual. And that's the work, that's the kind of work that we're doing at the moment. So this is the project in total. I won't go any further than this slide because it goes on a little bit, but essentially the project started in January of this year. I'm the secondee to basically move the project along, and everybody that I've got involved within this project is all in addition to their day job. It's engaging people who are working within those different arms of the public sector and actually getting them to work together and look at how we can work together differently to respond to some of these issues. So I appreciate this is quite small, so I will share this presentation if anybody would like it. Essentially the project in theory is meant to last for 2 years, but we're already at the 6-month point now and we're starting to talk about sustainability and how this actually becomes part of our business as usual activity. Actually, what key aims and products, what do we aim to actually physically get out of it? What are the tangible results? We're looking at improving outcomes for people leaving custody and people in the community. So how do we develop pathways from custody to community, and how do we map those services both for frontline practitioners and for people actually leaving custody and community, so that they know what's, both staff and people in custody and on release actually know what's available to them? How do they know what they can access within their region, within their community that's available to support them and their families? There's plenty of good stuff out there, but unless we know about it, we can't refer people correctly. And we're talking before around the improvement of pathway. We're talking about education, training, and employment, for instance, and those pathways from custody to community. And how do we link in some of the work and education that's done from a custody setting to job opportunities on release, making them realistic, making them tangible? That example that was given earlier about the rail track, and there being no realistic possibility of that person being able to access employment on release, that's just an absolute nightmare. That should never happen. That's not how we should design our curriculum. It should be designed and people should be allocated based on their ability to be able to complete the qualification successfully and then successfully move into onward training or onward employment. And that's essentially the work that we're trying to do here. So a little bit further down, I'll talk about how we engage local strategy partners, key stakeholders, employers, actually starting to address and sort of destigmatize, bust some myths around what it is to actually recruit people leaving custody, and using the employer's perspective and input then to actually inform on what we deliver from a custody setting. So we're actually enabling people to be more work ready, not putting people in a position to fail, because actually they've had the support they need around potentially around work readiness. They've had the support they need to be able to open a bank account, access the appropriate ID. Have they got somewhere safe and sustainable to live? Because otherwise we're going to be putting that person into work or proposing that person go into work and they've not got the right foundations there. So actually, how do we build some of those pathways to ensure that people are supported through that process? Closer partnership working, so touched on this a little bit already. And improving, aligning communication to make sure that we work differently. So actually, how does the prison system work with DWP? Not well presently, because actually accessing universal credit is something that I think it was mentioned earlier, that access to universal credit claim can't actually be activated until the day of release, when that person is already at risk. So actually the support systems and processes that are put in place for people in the community, they're not actually flexed or changed dependent on the needs of prison leavers. So that's part of the work that we're doing, aiming to work with individual aspects of public service to look at how do we focus on the needs of prison leavers and actually adjust public services accordingly. Some of that can't just be done locally. So we push on our local leaders to lobby for national change. DWP is a cracking example. The maximising of the local strategy partners and key anchors. So over to the side here, we've got the system change group. That's essentially our escalation point for the project. It's chaired by the Chief Executive of Liverpool City Council, Tony Reeves, and jointly on that panel, we've also got the #1 Governor of HMP Liverpool, Mark Livingston, Serena Kennedy, Merseyside Police Chief Constable. But in addition to that, we've got the likes of hospitals, universities, DWP, the Combined Authority, senior leads that sit on that strategic group. How do we get them to remove barriers for us at a local or a regional level, but also how do we get them to lobby for change for us at a national level? How do they use their influence? So we can take all the good work we potentially might be doing to them and say, look, we can do more of this, but actually this is the help that we need from you as in that position of authority and influence to be able to affect the services and improve them on the ground. The joint commissioning of services, we don't want to run before we can walk. So, but there's a lot to do around actually informing on one another's commissioning practices. What is commissioned in prisons and in probation and are intended to follow on from one another. Education, training, employment contracts are a prime example. The education, training, employment contract within prison and the one in the community are commissioned entirely separately. There is nothing written in that contract about how those two contracts should actually work together, those two providers, yet they are dealing with the same people at different points. We're having those conversations again. Somebody is repeating their story again about what they've done in custody, the need to data share, the need to have open lines of communication. That's all part of this project to actually start to have those realistic conversations about what that journey looks like, as opposed to what happens in custody and then what happens after custody. The establishment of a reducing reoffending strategy, a joint reducing reoffending strategy. I've read more strategies than I can count from various aspects of probation and prisons and councils. They all mention reducing reoffending somewhere, but they're not joined up. We need to find that common thread that runs through all those strategies and actually work from one document so that everybody's aims and targets are aligned. And then the advocacy of a multi-agency hub. So hubs exist in all sorts of shapes and forms. So from probation officers to the CFO activity hubs in the community centre, women's hubs, women's centres, departure lounges for individual prisons. But actually, how do we bring partners together who are delivering those services so that that individual who has left custody or is out on probation doesn't have to travel to 5 separate locations to access the statutory appointments? How do we actually not set people up to fail and allow them to access the services that they need to and the services that we say they should access? This bit over here is the kind of background to all this. This is all the strategy and all the different plans where reducing reoffending are mentioned. So essentially what I've done is gone into those and pulled out those key themes, and that's what makes up our key products and aims. I've mentioned our strategic group already and how we actually escalate some of our problems. This bit down here is actually how we move and actually how we take action on some of what we say we want to do. So this system change delivery leads, this is the board this is the part that I chair, the kind of intermediary bit before we actually get up to that escalation point. We try and fix what we can locally and look to see how we as managers on the ground actually are able to affect some of this work. In addition, so what we do is we bring the individual resettlement pathways leads together. So we've mentioned already quite a bit, education, training and employment down here. That's actually headed up by our HMPPS employment broker, New Futures Network, from anybody's aware of the work that they do. Accommodation is headed up by one of Liverpool City Region's predominant accommodation providers, so Onward Housing. Due to be taken over and co-chaired with South Liverpool Housing as well. So that group is predominantly made up of housing providers, and actually how do we work with the likes of housing providers, probation, CRS providers to actually ensure that housing and access to housing, more importantly that access bit on somebody leaving custody. We talk about people being risk averse and local authorities processing duty to refer funds in an untimely way. How do we start to address some of that some of that lack of knowledge essentially for the people that are actually processing some of those pieces of work? How do we get them to understand the impact that it's having on people and the drastic outcomes that it can potentially lead to? Finance, benefit and debt, that's chaired by DWP and some of their senior leads there. Really good links in with the accommodation team there around beginning to understand housing benefits, actually maximising universal credit and benefits access. Children, Families and Communities is headed up by Chief Superintendent Andy Ryan from Merseyside Police, and he's actually the lead for the preventative policing department within Merseyside Police. Brand new initiative, actually looking at the root cause of problems as opposed to putting sticking plaster over sticking plaster. Looking at why is that individual why are we getting multiple reports of that individual causing issues, causing problems? Where does this originate from? And then the physical.
Wrapping up now, sorry Claire, if that's okay, just a 5-minute warning.
Oh yeah, no problem. I'm nearly done now. Physical and mental health is chaired by our Mersey care provider Reconnect, Leah Stitchbury, one of our mental healthcare nurses at HMP Liverpool. Essentially, that's a brand new group and we're just about establishing it now. So that gives you a bit of an idea about how all of these groups actually feed into that delivery leads meeting. We actually look, how can we support some of this work? What barriers are in place? Can we try and shift some of those locally? And then anything that we can't, we do shift up to our system change strategic group. I've talked a lot. I'm going to stop talking, but happy to take any questions if anybody has them.
Just the first question, I think, to clarify for everybody, is what are you looking for from this network potentially?
Good question. I'm looking for input. If anybody would like to be involved with the project, if anybody has opinions, they would like to sit on the groups, they would actually like to listen to some of the work and some of the changes that we're proposing. I'd be more than happy to have an onward conversation with you on whether or not you would like to be involved, or whether or not you would be happy for me to bring some suggestions and some of the things that we're working on to this forum, or any other forums that you think actually would benefit from us having some sort of input.
I think one of the things that I just want to flag up is the obvious tensions within some of your like pathway leads. So for example, the DWP, bane of my life.
Yep, me too.
Like them being in charge of the finance, benefit and debt is a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit like the guilt, the lunatics leading the asylum kind of thing. And just the tension between, for example, them trying to shoehorn our community into work when they're potentially in supported accommodation and it's not, doesn't make any sense for them financially to work. Just those tensions that exist within the system that need, you know, we can do all the great work on the floor sorting out these issues, but if we're hitting barriers from a systemic point of view, like it just all falls by the wayside. So just for them to be really honest about what's going on, what they're trying to achieve and what's actually going on the ground, and to deal with that before we come up with the innovative solutions that we can come up with, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think it's a really valid point. So many of the partner agencies, I mean, my own past experience of DWP has not been positive. And actually, I wasn't expecting a massive amount actually when I involved DWP. They have been probably one of the most proactive groups and one of the proactive, and it really surprised me. And there's massive chunks of there's massive issues whereby we have got to be brutally honest about what the problems are on the ground, because otherwise any system that we develop to work around the existing one, or any new ways of working that we actually start to embed or foster and develop, they have to be realistic, because there's no point, they will never be sustainable otherwise. So again, another reason why I would like and value this input from this group wherever possible.
One thing I will add to this, is there any criteria for the partner organisations who you work with? Is the criteria for them to become a partner organisation because they really have a level of corporate social responsibility? And are they willing to employ the people who pass through your system? Because from my own personal lived experience, I've said to people who I was referred to back in the day from various organisations, said, would your organisation employ me? And they'll say no, and I'll say, well, I'm not going to engage with you to keep you in a job if your organisation wouldn't employ me.
Absolutely. HMPPS is probably one of the main offenders for that, because actually we talk the big talk about recruiting prison leavers. You see it all the time, New Futures Network, that's what it's there for, to actually work with employers to recruit people leaving prison. But actually, would HMPPS do the same? In the majority of the time, no. The conversations I'm having now with the likes of HR teams and local authorities HR team around addressing some of the stigma that comes with actually, oh, somebody's got a criminal record, oh, that means we just wouldn't even go there. Starting to address some of that and actually look at, well, what is the risk there? What are we actually talking about here? What is the issue?
Definitely.
Can I just add something? Hi, Claire. I'm Tev. Sorry, I joined the meeting late. Working for an organisation who embrace employing those with lived experience, it's the Forward Trust. Me included, we've got around 250 odd staff members now all present with lived experience of either addiction and or offending, some quite at senior levels. I think I'd be interested in having a chat with you about employing ex-offenders and being employed as an ex-offender myself, because I think, having looked at your flowchart, and unless I missed anything, there isn't much input from people with lived experience so you can get a true picture. And that would, to me, be a really big missing link. So perhaps Marie Claire and Adam and I can have a chat, and maybe we can collectively join your consultation as a group, in which case then you'll have 3 voices, 4, 5, 10 voices rather than just one. But I'm sure we're all going to present with the same sort of opinions and issues that need to be tackled. So yeah, that's something that I'd like to pick up. And during that discussion, perhaps we can have a sub discussion about you speaking to our HR team. I think their experiences are going to be invaluable. Perhaps you can get some quotes to use out, you know, in terms of the positive feedback that we've got working with ex-offenders. So yeah,
absolutely. That kind of approach whereby we kind of take that joint approach. So it's all very well and good me going out and speaking to employers and saying this is something you need to consider. You need to consider working with people who've previously been in prison. It's all very well and good me saying that, but the power that comes from working with employers who have been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, that's who the employers are going to realistically listen to, because I'm doing my job. That's exactly what I should say. But actually, as an employer, working with an employer, actually, I'm really interested in what you have to say as an employer who has had success dealing with people with that kind of experience. I'm working with Johnson's Hotel Linen, for instance, and you've mentioned before around the industries within prisons. So many of them have got prison laundries. How do we start to link some of that training and some of that experience within that prison setting to realistic jobs on release? Johnson's have been cracking allies there. They've actually supported us massively and working with us actually to develop not only how they take on, but also how we improve how we actually deliver within a custody setting, and actually starting to prepare people for employment prior to release. So definitely this is, yeah,
I'm going to ask you another challenging question, and it's going to lead to another question, just to warn you. Just from that little discussion we had, I'm beginning to get the impression, and it's not a problem if this is it, but there could be some duplication here, because it seems to be that your main focus is on employment, which we all agree is a purposeful activity and has saved our taxpayers God knows how many billions in reducing reoffending. But I think there's a bit more to it than that.
Oh yeah.
So in terms of percentage, in terms of your overall objective, how would you weight employment?
From the project as a whole?
Yeah.
I wouldn't weight it. I wouldn't outweigh it against any of the other pathways. I think we have to prioritize all of them equally, because I think as somebody mentioned before, it's about the individual and the individual's needs. So we need to make sure that those pathways exist and they function, but actually whatever support is given to the individual, we've got a system in place to support them regardless of their need. So if, for instance, it is education, actually we've got our fingers on the pulse about actually what employers are we working with, what training opportunities are there. I don't think you can weight it. Don't get me wrong, I think there are certain things that are more important than others when it comes to resettlement, accommodation primarily, because there's no point in getting somebody a job if they don't know where to live. So there's things that we should tackle first, but actually in terms of
ultimate objective,
yeah, in terms
of you've just said what I'm really grateful I've heard, because to be fair, because
we were testing you.
No, not at all. But we had at one of our previous events, the topic of discussion was around employment of ex-offenders, and it also took a steer off to focus on people as human beings and dealing with their primary concerns, and not just shoving employment down everyone's throat, because that seems to be the golden ticket. So the fact that you're willing, able, and hopefully will end up treating people as individuals and dealing with their needs. You quite rightly said accommodation is a huge factor. Addiction is another huge issue. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys were kind of dealing with that in the way that I would like to see it be dealt with. So that's great, thank you.
No worries. I think there's a bit to be said there around how we actually demonstrate our success and how we actually how do we tell we're doing what we're meant to be doing? So as part of that, we want to start collating case studies, and we're going out to different aspects of probation, complex case court. Who are you working with that has been through the system and is stuck and is basically, we talk about, is getting no answer from agencies, from public services. Let us work with them. Let us actually look at what are the actual problems, who are the services that are involved, and apply a solutions-based logic to it, whereby this person cannot end up in crisis again. We cannot fail them again. Actually, so how do we work together? And we talked before around doing things with as opposed to to, and it has to be that person-centered approach.
Claire, one of the things that HMP Birmingham are doing that I'm sure you're aware of is something around like a resettlement hub model, where they're kind of running a pilot project, and there's things that I just think are so far from what's going to happen in reality, but there's certain things that I think could be key in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So one of the solutions that they've had on the data release issues, because it's all about data release, making that a bit more streamlined, which I think everybody would agree with needs to happen. So having a probation officer just outside the gates as part of the departure lounge-esque kind of setup, where they haven't got a mission to their own probation area, they can actually report there and then, find out about their onward accommodation potentially, and just focus on that and their substance misuse appointments. So just to sort of expose you to that, I'm sure you're working with them already.
Absolutely. I think revolving door are involved with the revolving door involved with some of that, and some of the focus groups and forums around it. I think might potentially be, it might be a different pilot, but that was the one I was aware of. But I think particularly around, you mentioned departure lounges, and I talked before around that kind of access to hubs, that whole kind of hub access, whereby we're bringing statutory requirements and appointments to the individual. So that should be any prison that is releasing somebody needs to have a departure lounge, and that's the function that it needs to fulfill, to be able to allow for those statutory appointments to take place in one place. That person hasn't got to travel around, hasn't got to do a round trip.
But I think some of the issues around that, like just critical thinking, is if you've got a probation officer that's stationed at the prison, what happens when they're off sick? You know, is there going to be, it's that consistency of approach, isn't it? That you need almost a second and third layer of like backups for when that person's off with COVID or having maternity leave, whatever their issue is.
That data sharing and having access to some kind of joint platform, whereby if that individual is off sick, you've got the ability, someone else has got the ability to be able to pick up that work and be able to see that person's case notes. There's massive amounts of getting the basics right. When we talk about data sharing, we're talking about it from within HMPPS a lot of the time. Not only do we start, we're not even starting to involve the local authorities at that point, we're getting it right from a prison and probation perspective.
Thank you. Has anybody got anything else they wanted to speak to Claire about, or the group, before we close up?
No, we're just, if everybody's okay, should I launch the poll for
Yeah, please. Thanks, Claire. Thanks for that, for the presentation. It was really, I think, topical in terms of the prison reform and what needs to happen.